if we laid you on your back and we just said, how do you breathe, and practiced it, and what we're looking for, long, slow, deep, full 360 breath with tongue on the roof of the mouth and out through the nose. You want to feel it inflate like a balloon in every direction. Go straight to someone who has like uneasy balance. Try and breathe in that position, go for it. And they'll straight away go, that's hard. They know it because they've just learnt like what it feels like to expand in a full 360. So then intimately, straight away, they've got an understanding that breathing on their back is easier than breathing in standing or single leg stands.
Welcome to the Restore to Explore podcast from your soulmates at the Foot Collective. We're on a mission to empower humans to restore their natural health and function from the ground up, so we can all explore movement and life with freedom and confidence. This week's episode is brought to you by the TFC Soulmate, your ultimate all-in-one restoration and exploration tool. Made from cork, TFC Soulmates are an eco-friendly, lightweight and durable mobility, balance and foot training tool that can be used as a massage roller, foot roller, balance beam, a slant board, and even includes 2 toe resistance bands. Every TFC Soulmate comes with access to an in-depth training manual with guided routines from TFC health professionals to make improving foot function and balance fun and accessible for all ages and abilities. For 10% off your Soulmate, head to thefootcollective.com and use the code R2E. That's R, the number 2, E at checkout. You'll find the details in the show notes.
Tommy W.
We are back.
Back in the hot seat in the official
the new digs
TFC podcast studio.
Which looks fantastic.
First time here, thank you very much. Yep, yeah, we're pretty happy with it. Got the lights.
I don't know if you can see this. The green door is still my favourite feature.
Yeah.
So it's a look.
You can't see that in the video, but
it's a shame.
You can imagine.
Yeah.
But mate, it's good to have you.
Thank you for having me back.
I haven't seen you since I got married, I believe.
Probably would have been, yeah.
I think so.
Because time has flown by, yeah.
Honeymoon and then the US and so on. So I've missed you, we've all, I'm sure the listeners would agree, we've all missed your wisdom.
Thank you.
We're pretty keen to dig into the topic of the breath-foot connection, but I'd love to just get a bit of a recap. I've obviously been keeping tabs on you.
He does that.
Yeah. And you've been up to some pretty cool stuff. So maybe, probably most recent is your half marathon.
Yes.
Talk to us about that.
So the half marathon in Noosa. So for those who don't know, Sunshine Coast. That would have been 2 weekends ago now. I think,
yeah.
Roughly. So
fully recovered then?
Yeah, fully recovered. Body actually went really well, surprisingly. The only thing that was strangely sore afterwards was my right knee for no reason. I hadn't had right knee pain at all prior or during. It just hurt afterwards, probably like for a day and a half, and then it was fun. So
wow, how interesting.
Very bizarre.
Have you got an inkling as to why?
Probably just the load of the 21K and then...
But why the right knee?
Yeah, look, I do have an inkling for that too, but I think it
unsubstantiated.
Yeah, we'll follow that up later. But realistically, yes, I think it's just like my patella, to be honest. But yeah, it went really good. So I did it in my Vibrams, my 5 fingers.
Yeah,
I was the only person on course who I saw running in any form of natural shoe or footwear, which was really interesting. There was one very common shoe out there. It was a bright yellow Nike, really big, and it seemed to be like the shoe of the season, essentially.
It's carbon plate or something?
I think it was the carbon plate model, but I didn't take it off to fling it to see if it worked off anyone. But no, it was a very popular shoe out there. But yeah, no other barefooters or natural footwear, which is a bit of a shame. But did it at 1:50, which was cool.
Nice. And what's a good time for? What's a really good time for? What's the world record?
Oh, the world. Jesus, that's a good question. So I wonder. Looking at the world record, I mean, a good time is an 1:30. That's what people substantiate a good time. I would say
hour 7 it reckons.
Yeah, that would be about right. That sounds about right. It's people are aiming to break or try to get the 2-hour mark for the full marathon and stuff. Because once upon a time, 3 hours was amazing. Amazing. Obviously, as people push
for things. A full. Yeah.
And so I think an hour and a half is a really good fitness base, I think, for anyone to aim for that. Yeah. So the 1:50 was good because it was the first proper half marathon I'd run in 10 years, I reckon.
Wow. And had you run one leading up to...
No. So we went as far
yeah,
as
what's your
15.
training schedule like leading up to that?
So yeah, and you were aware even during when we were doing the podcast, we're running it 3 times a week. It built up for a long time, just doing zone 2, which was all nasal and a lot of barefoot or natural shoe equivalent running. And then so this year we started doing a lot more sort of zone 4, 5 work. So like the faster anaerobic work on a Monday, and then we'd still keep like relatively slow runs on Thursday and Saturday. So the Thursday run would have been like I think we got it to 42 minutes at that point, and then the longer runs were like over the hour mark, slowly building them up. And again, I'd run some math and computated like how much progressions and stuff to do. So we were essentially on track because we're training for the Mount Kosciuszko 30 at the end of the year. So that is the goal. This was just like a few other friends were doing the 10K up there, and it's like, well, it gives us something to do and see how we go. Because realistically, if you can run 15, you can run the 21. It's just how fast do you want to do and how much wear do you want to put on your body afterwards. So.
Okay. And for people listening, I know this isn't really the topic of the podcast, but the zone 2 thing is something that's pretty important, I think, for when you're starting to run and building up your aerobic base. Do you just want to touch on that briefly?
Yeah. So like,
for anyone listening, because I know there'd be people who are either runners or want to be runners.
Or even people who want to learn to breathe well with running as an object. So like,
and we have done a podcast on this a while ago. Yeah. I'm just not sure how much we've really delved into the zone 2 concept.
Could be our next podcast.
What are the zones and why do you want to be in zone 2?
So if you really look, like anything, there's a lot of different zones across different ways people interpret the zones. So traditionally speaking, zone 2 is the speed in which you can continue having a conversation when you're running, often done by a talk test, which is like you can either just talk or you can go 181, 182, 183, 184, 185, 186. That's, me saying that is like in one breath, therefore I'm probably in my zone 2. What that means is the equivalent is that you're sending a signal through your activity to your cellular self, so your deeper physiology, to get an adaptation. And that adaptation is about having better like aerobic capacity, right? So if I'm trying to become fit for endurance, I'm trying to improve my sort of VO2 ability, I need to make sure I'm sending the right signals. And that's where people kind of get caught in the trap of like, they try to run too quick too regularly with their longer runs or their intermediate distant runs, and they get too fatigued. And there's a lot of like different ways to look at it, but more simply, it's like you're just trying to tell your body to adapt in a certain way. And if I want to be better with my aerobic capacity, I need to send the right signal for that. And then as you build and build and build, what you find is you just become like relatively fitter and it's less fatiguing, so you can push a bit faster, and then you can push a bit faster. So you don't really have to run fast to learn to run fast from like a endurance running perspective.
I get you. So for context there, aerobic means you're using oxygen as the primary fuel source for energy production in the body, and anaerobic is when you're not using oxygen, you're using other energy systems.
Yeah, such as glycogen, sugar, stuff in the body.
And if you are trying to run too fast and you're not building up slowly enough, then you're really just training your anaerobic system, or you're more so training your anaerobic system, which is not the adaptation that you want in order to build endurance specifically. Correct. Obviously, it has a place in other contexts.
Yeah, well, it has a huge place, and like at any given point, like even if you're doing zone 2 training, there's always some level of anaerobic work going on in the background. Yeah. Like your body doesn't, vice versa. Yeah, it's a push-pull system, so it doesn't just do one or the other; it does all of it together. So it's just how much of the stimulus am I doing to then create the adaptation that I want? It's essentially being specific for the adaptation.
Sure. Like if you're trying to do a half marathon, then you don't want to be training your sprint anaerobic systems. You want to be
a sprinter, which is like, I'm trying to run 100 in say 10 seconds, is completely different as a stimulus to running anything past a kilometer. Like 2 different kettles of fish. So
yeah. And so for context there, if you want to get really fast, it probably is a good idea to do some zone 2 training, but you probably need to focus more on building up your anaerobic. What would that be, zone 3?
Yeah, well, so like probably top of zone 3, but zone 4, 5 is like really where you're pushing. And like you think zone 5 in this context, like again, there are zones that can say 6s and 7s, but I just stick to the old school traditional zone 1 to 5 because it makes it easier. You look at like Olympic level swim sprinters as a really good example. Some of them have changed their entire model now to do a lot more like high intensity, short interval work minimizing a lot of the distance stuff and having long rests like they would for traditional track sprinters. Because a lot of it is, again, they're trying to train to be really fast in the water. And why is it that they're spending so much time accumulating that aerobic base when they don't really need it? So like if you ask a 50-meter sprint swimmer to like go swim 1500, probably knacker them because that's not what they've been training for years and years and years.
Yeah.
And it's just...
And the energy systems they're using are different.
Yeah. Where you doing zone 4 or 5 training or that higher intensity stuff is good is like it is really useful to push yourself to see where the limit is, and that helps you with the adaptation because we know anaerobic work does have a benefit on the aerobic system to a point. That's what the whole HIIT Tabata training was about.
So, like you said, you were doing a lot of long, slow runs, zone 2, and then some faster runs to train that system so that you can rely on both.
And as we'll touch on, to train my feet. So
True.
As you know, like you were around when I really started my transition from just running to like barefoot running or like natural shoe running, and I took the long, slow approach of making sure that everything mechanically was dealing with it to a point, so been building up quite well to not have any injuries. Touch wood, that keeps going. And then as we got to a place of competency, it's like, all right, now we can start doing some faster stuff on the grass, and like the body's holding up much better doing it. But again, it's like once a week, and it's, following a philosophy of 80-20 to a point of trying to not go any more than 20% of the week doing it. But I've also been playing touch footy once a week, which contributed to my running volume relatively, which is again, obviously a lot of sprint repeat stuff, which if I was just running for just training for running, I probably wouldn't have done that as much, but I was like having fun. Yeah. And touch footy's fun.
So is the issue when people are, like, do you think people get caught in like zone 3 where they're like, they're sort of going for a long run, but they're going too fast for the adaptation that they want, and they're also not doing a really fast zone 4 or 5 run, which is giving them an adaptation to, a sprint kind of thing. So they're caught in this sort of midway between,
probably said in like a really nice way, I think, is like they are getting an adaptation that it's going in the direction that they want. It just comes at a much higher cost of whether that is neurological fatigue, like physiological fatigue, more in like that cellular level, and just like musculoskeletal. Your body has to cop a lot more when you are producing more like lactic acid than lactate and pyruvate, and like how it's trying to get rid of the garbage or like that sort of stuff going on in the body. Zone 2 doesn't have that as much. So like the physiological premise or the definition of zone 2 training is like not going above 2 millimoles of lactate in your body, right? So there's a physiological marker, which you'd have to look more into the science as to why they specifically pick such a level, but like that's the general idea of it. And so you can touch it, but it comes down. Touch it comes down. So what it says is that your training stimulus is producing a response, but your body's able to deal with the response and clean off a lot of the fatigue. So
it's easier to recover from.
It's
less soreness.
Literally all of the runs we've done, I've been able to run the next day if I wanted to.
True.
There's no tie. Whereas like a lot of people who do their zone 3, 4, 4, 5 stuff, and they're thinking that's zone 2, they're knackered the next day, and they can go run, but they're very sluggish and fatigued, and they don't really know why per se. It's because your body hasn't recovered.
Yeah. Makes sense. And one simple tip, I think we talked about this in that Breathing for Running podcast, is to make sure you're in zone 2 is that you can maintain nasal inhale and exhale throughout the whole run.
Yeah, so that comes
That's a good simple tip for people to pick up.
Super simple tip, and it forces you to be there more than anything. Yeah. Like you have no choice. You can't run. There's a certain point that you have to switch to nasal in, mouth out, or mouth in, mouth out. And at zone 2, like you're doing it well if you do nasal. Yeah. 100%. And then there, again, like we spoke about, there's biomechanical reasons. There's like carbon dioxide tolerance / stress response things that come with that as well. Sure. But super simple, just to stick zone 2, breathe through your nose.
Yeah. Cool. Well, we can probably put a pin in that one. Nice little side quest there, rabbit hole. But you also you've been working full time as a clinician in a new clinic. I believe we haven't had a podcast since you started there, I think.
No, I don't think so. No.
You've been seeing a bunch of foot pain conditions.
Yes, a lot of foot pain conditions.
Any big takeaways from that so far?
I suppose
is TFC completely wrong about what we're doing?
TFC's so wrong.
Yeah.
No, so to be honest with you, I think the biggest thing that I have not so much learned, because we've spoken about it a lot, but it is like interesting to see put out in practice, is like I rock toe socks and I rock my natural shoes and I show people all the time, but it's always still remembering to come at it where the client or like the person who you're with is at in their journey. Because again, like for you to say that those shoes are wrong, or you need different shoes is such a stress response, such a friction point for them because they don't know any of this stuff. Like it's all new to them. So when you see them and often like they get curious a lot, particularly if you do exercises with them, their feet feel better or they can visibly see that it's moving better. They go, oh, that's cool. And it's really always remembering like that's the goal because a lot of people in our world, we know all these different shoe brands and it's like, yeah, this is natural for it's second nature for them. They've never heard of any of them. Yeah. And it's like, there's a world like that out there and it's a bit freaky for them to be honest. So that's been interesting to see because again, it's, whilst we think it's kind of common, like, you know, I'll mention all these people who are foot people. Even like Kelly Starrett as an example. I dropped his name to a physio today and he's like, no idea who that is. It's like, okay, interesting. Like we live in two different worlds. And I think that's been interesting. A lot of, again, just seeing what we've commonly seen of like, there are people who've been put in orthotics with no plan to get out of them. That's still a thing. Yeah. It's quite a common thing. And I think just educating is really the biggest thing that I've had to do and a lot of. Like my entire clinical list is essentially either going to be teaching breathing appointments, running appointments, foot problems or swimmers. Like that is essentially what I do. I still see people for the back pain and neck pain as they come in, but most of my list takes up those 8 things. Also those 4 things. And yeah, it's just really interesting to see where people have come from.
For sure. All different backgrounds, but probably generally they've all had things done to them ad infinitum possibly and never really investigated to like
there is common denominators that no one's pointed them in a different direction. They have done the status quo and had the same result and wondered why they're still where they are. So
well, I'm glad there's clinicians like you who are out there on
try and fight
in the trenches. And you also had an interesting I can't remember how the opportunity popped up, but you got the chance to run, was it a workshop with a bunch of podiatry students or, what was that? So what was that scene?
So through the job, we have a contract somewhat set up with the QT podiatry course of the Queensland University of Technology.
Oh, true. Through the health club.
Yeah, so it's like a couple of years ago, they reached out. My boss knows the guy who runs it and then it's like, you want to come over and talk to them? And it was a lot to do with like functional assessment is what they call it, of like how to look at squats, how to look at lunges. Last year there was a lot of force deck work as well, but obviously me being me coming into it and like I was like, I'll happily help out, and it was a lot to do with what are some clinical tests that you would do to assess people's stuff is essentially what I got told. And then the stuff turned out to be like, how do you look at walking, running, squatting and balance? I was like, oh, this is gonna be fun. So we did that, and then the other one was like a bunch of sort of palpatory skills or like understanding landmarks and how to assess a leg. So in a sense, like the first one went, which is the palpatory stuff, and that was like okay, and it was just teaching them essentially some of the basics. But when it comes to the assessment, you know, what I posted about was like, you know, I took a bunch of the balance beams in and like we had a bit of fun with it and like showed them that there were ways to assess balance that are, you know, here's what the research says, here's the clinical standard, but also here's a way you can make that fun, and here's how you can show it integrates into this thing, and then taking those frameworks across to like, this is how it affects your jumping, which then affects the way that you're walking and like running, and just sort of built them through and trying to integrate like these ideas of a little bit of play and a bit of fun into like, you don't just have to do this stock standard mundane clinical approach. And like a lot of the clinical measures that we get given, whilst they're not necessarily arbitrary, is not the right word for them. Like, and I explained to them, there's the triple hop test or like the cross hop test. It doesn't mean much to me. Like, I don't really care if you can hop really far 3 times. I care if you can do it well, right? And like, that's not really written into the metric itself.
It's just distance. It's a bit more binary, is it?
Yeah.
It's just a measure of distance, but not the quality.
Yeah, and like I'd rather quality over distance first, and then you build the distance. Like again, it's good to have, that's why we like balance. It's good to have variations, but there's like endpoints to that variation, right? Like if you fall off the beam, you've probably gone too far one way.
Yeah.
Like, you know, they don't necessarily pick that stuff up. So we just explained a bunch of that, which was really cool. And they were shocked at how much I knew about feet as a physio. I was like, yeah, I didn't necessarily learn that in physio school, but You know, it's one of my passions.
Yeah.
So.
And how was it received? How did they like? Did they like it? Did you get a chance to have feedback afterwards? Or
I think it's a lot like anyone who's ever done any university lecturing or tutoring. So this is not the first time I've done it. Like, you get a lot of kids who love it. They think it's great. I think there's some kids who aren't interested, but I don't necessarily know if they're interested in uni as a
interested
whole.
in much. Yeah.
And a few of them who aren't super interested aren't always like, they're going into like, they're doing med or something next anyway, so they're not fully invested. But then there are some, like there's a couple of really like bright kids who are just super interested with questions and like ask really good questions. And like, I don't know if they're gonna go into be podiatrists at the end, but like, it was really cool to see a couple at least like really interesting like people in there.
It makes you think, doesn't it? You really do have to get them young, and that's a good little seed planted in some of their heads. But it's amazing that physio, podiatry, any health degree really doesn't include like the basics of human movement, as in, you shouldn't just be assessed on your academic knowledge. You should be assessed on your ability, at least your ability to improve your own movement.
And that was what was
capacity.
amazing actually to look at. Is like, so we did the standardized closed balance test. I'm like, you guys, like, you haven't done this and you're not that good at it. Like, that's okay, but this is interesting. Like, they haven't done a lot of those physical competencies, nor been encouraged to. And it's like quite fun. So we did like the staring beam challenge, and like each class had a winner.
Yeah.
And like, I got challenged and I didn't lose. It was good.
Of course.
I kept the mantle.
I would have been really disappointed.
Yeah, so would I. Would have. But like, it's just one of those things where like those sorts of things, like you can see everyone's laughing and having fun. It's like, this is a great way to learn and to practice and to like get that community vibe going. And all it was standing on a beam having a bit of fun.
Pretty simple.
Who would have thought?
Yeah.
Get a piece of wood and put it down and stand on it.
I think we're going to have a big brainstorming session about how we can get into the unis with this stuff. I think
there's a whole world there.
Yeah.
We've got the door open. Gonna have to go hard.
Yeah, you've got your foot in the door, so to speak.
That was gold.
So speaking of feet, segue, this breath-foot connection. Now, it isn't necessarily intuitive to people that your breath and your feet would be intimately connected. I think people intuitively understand that the whole body is connected.
Yes.
The knee bone connects to the thigh bone and so on. But if you were to say a client comes in and they've got a foot issue and you look at their breathing, it might be a bit like, hey, why? What are you doing? What's going on? So I'm sure there's a fair bit to unpack, but let's say I am a client. I've come in, I've said, hey, I've got this foot issue, and obviously you're going to have a look at my feet. You may not go straight to the breath, in terms of, even though it's important to assess, obviously you want to look at the area that is a problem. And let's say you do get to the breath. Why?
Okay, yeah. So it as obviously probably like the key caveat is like when you see someone for the first time particularly, right? You don't often touch on that stuff too much because again, you've come to see me for a foot thing, and then if I tell you it's a breath thing or related to a breath thing, sometimes that doesn't really connect with the way that you've assumed this appointment would go, and that creates friction or stress, and then it's not that you won't come back, but it's...
Well, I might just go and talk to someone who's going to look at my foot.
And massage it or do something else. So it's not necessarily in alignment, but within the second session, almost every time, right?
Yeah, okay.
So I think when you're trying to break it down and really understand it, it's sort of like a lot of people who do have foot problems also do have like knee, hip or back problems as well. So there's an easier way to like connect the dots for them versus just going foot to trunk. And I think the easiest way to establish it as an idea in your head, take away all the mechanics, take away everything else, is like if we laid you on your back and we just said, how do you breathe, and practiced it. And what we're looking for, like we've touched on and pretty much every time we've talked about breathing, is that long, slow, deep, full 360 breath with tongue on the roof of the mouth and out through the nose. So if you can feel that expanding, so the way I teach people is like, it's inside your hip bones. Can you feel it there? Can you feel it around like the C shape of your hand? So laterally into the back and here, and then like thumbs
under the ribs for anyone listening. Yeah.
And then anything into your lower back. So like where most people would know like the QL muscle is, for an example, like you get in there and like you want to feel it inflate like the balloon in every direction.
Sure. So that, and just for people's context who may not have listened to our previous podcasts, that is distinct from what most people think of as belly breathing, where if they're lying on their back, their belly is rising and falling, but nothing else is really moving.
Yeah.
So you're talking about a 360-degree expansion of the rib cage
Abdomen,
and
ribs,
the abdomen.
lower back, because as the diaphragm drops as you breathe in, it expands in a full 360.
Yeah.
Less right at the spine because of the bony articulations, but the ribs and everywhere else expand. And you can feel it, and the analogy I always use is just like a balloon inflating. Like you can feel it under your fingers in all directions.
Sure. The balloon doesn't just inflate on one side. It inflates
it's sort of non-biased where it inflates. When someone gets that concept on the bed, and sometimes that takes teaching, you can go straight to, like, depending upon the position, it could be side lying, could be lying on your tummy, but as soon as you go straight to standing, go straight to someone who has like uneasy balance, or like you can go straight to single leg balance, try and breathe in that position, go for it. And they'll straight away go, that's hard. That's really hard. It's like, yeah, it's really hard for you, isn't it? And like they know it because they've just learned like what it feels like to expand in a full 360. So then intimately straight away they've got an understanding that breathing on their back is easier than breathing in standing or single leg stance or in an RDL stance or whatever, squat, whatever the position is. And then the connection's made of like, that's harder, I don't know why, but it's harder and I understand that. And that's, I think, the easiest way I've ever like got people to the concept of like, that's because your foot's on the floor, and then you build them up through the chain of events, which is what we're going to unpack today.
Okay. So they've had I think that's a good point just to hit on there, is that sometimes a simple experience that takes a couple of minutes.
Honestly, like 2 minutes. Sometimes.
Lie down, breathe, stand up, try and do the same breath or breathing pattern. Can you feel the difference? Yes. That is probably more powerful than 20 minutes of talking to someone about the connections in the body.
I think it is far more powerful because they get it straight away.
Because it's like, okay, I have had an experience of what you're talking about, and it gives a foundation to then, you're probably going to have to talk about it in some way, but ideally some talk, mostly and then felt experience.
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't always work out. It's the 80-20 model, but 80% experience, 20% explanations, probably not a bad way to like framework it, because again, if you feel the thing, and I know what I want you to feel, so I get you to do this, and then I get you to practice that, and then I explain what I think you should be feeling, and it's like, oh, that's actually pretty close. Yeah, like you already then come across as a position of power and knowledge, because you're explaining what they're feeling, and they're feeling it, and they know that's what they're feeling. So it's like, it's all feeding into them understanding their own body. It's like, okay, this is cool. And often, again, if it's like a right ankle issue, a right foot issue, and we find that, the balance and everything else is a bit harder on that side. You do it on the left side, it's like, oh, it's really easy. It's like, yeah, now they know there's a difference left and right, and they know there's a difference between how they balance on that foot and how they breathe so well on that side compared to that side. They innately know, it's like, oh, should it be like that? No, it should be a little bit closer than what it is. And again, it often just comes as like they struggle to breathe, they struggle to take a full breath in, like it becomes more chesty, it's a bit of panic on their face. Like all those things happen, whereas before they were calm and relaxed because they're on the bed and it was really easy.
Okay, so why? So, okay, it's much harder for me to breathe while I'm standing on my right side than my left, or when I'm standing compared to lying down. So what's going on?
Gravity, what a talent. So, I mean, let's go through it piece by piece. We'll start with the bones first and work our way out, because I think it's the easiest way. So we know that your foot essentially has to make two shapes. What are the two shapes?
Mobile adapter, rigid lever, pronation,
pronation and supination. So if your foot can do those things, we're really good. But when your foot goes into a rigid lever, that supinated position, we know just from the bony structure that biases a certain motion of your hip joint, which is external rotation. So if I'm standing on 2 feet, I turn my knees out, you'll see like your big toe knuckle lift off the ground. You'll feel that like rotate out. That's going to cause external rotation at the hip, right? We know that external rotation of your like what we call femur or thigh bone biases a certain motion at the pelvis. That is a posterior tilt, or like tucking your bum under. That tucking, then if you're doing that on both sides, is tucking the pelvis, which is then going to round your back. Now, if I change any part of the position of your back, I'm changing the attachment points of like what your diaphragm's pulling on. So you have to remember that your diaphragm attaches to multiple bits, but in your back, it's around what we call the thoracolumbar junction, or where your sort of mid-back attaches to your low back, around sort of from the vertebra perspective, at T11, 12, L1, L2 section. So if I start tucking my pelvis, I'm changing the mechanical link from a bony standpoint of where the diaphragm is pulling onto either drop or come back up. Part one.
That makes sense.
Part two is then if you just look at the other sort of, depending on how you frame things, the other diaphragm, the pelvic floor diaphragm, same thing. If I'm affecting my pelvis and my hip, I'm affecting the mechanical link of what will happen to the pelvic floor.
Yeah.
So then all of a sudden we know if you have any influence on either the pelvic floor or the diaphragm, you're changing their muscle length tension relationships. We know that they're going to move differently depending upon different angles.
We wanted to take a quick break from the episode to let you know about our ultimate free foot health resource. If you're listening, you've probably already started the journey towards improving your foot and movement health, but if you're still wearing conventional shoes most of the time, that's anything cushioned, heeled, narrow or rigid, it's kind of like taking one step forward and 2 steps back. Knowing what shoe is right for you though can be super confusing. That's why we made the Guide to Foot Freedom. We've taken everything our team of foot health experts have learned over the years and synthesized it into one handy manual, packed with all you need to know about unleashing the natural power of your foundation. You'll learn how to understand your feet, the truth about modern footwear, the 5 F's for finding natural footwear, plus a step-by-step guide with training videos to help you assess your foot function and improve it so you can safely and seamlessly transition into shoes that will finally give your feet freedom. The best part is, like I said, it's absolutely free. Just head to thefootcollective.com and click Learn to find the free ebook, The Guide to Foot Freedom. You'll find the link in the show notes. Now back to the episode.
Let's just dive into length tension relationship for people listening, if they're not familiar with that.
So real simple, throughout any motion you have a really short range and a really long range of a muscle, and then there's somewhere in between. So we know that muscles tend to be strongest approximately in their middle range, give or take.
So maybe to visualize, if you've got your elbow completely straight or your elbow completely bent, those would probably be the weaker parts of that range of motion, whereas directly in the middle you'd be able to,
which for your elbow is like 90 degrees,
yeah,
roughly. So
hold the most weight.
And we know that, again, it's going to vary per person, per experience, per movement pattern, but these are rough rules that carry across everyone. So you can train to be strong in ends of range, which is what a lot of work we do outside of obviously having fun and balancing. But like if you can understand that, then you know if I fully tuck my pelvis around it, or if I fully anteriorly tilt it and go the other way, which happens to go with that foot pronation posture or that foot flattening posture, then all of a sudden I know that I'm influencing the way that the pelvic floor and diaphragm are going to move.
Sure.
And that therefore is going to influence the way my breathing is, because the diaphragm is the primary breathing muscle.
Cool, that makes sense.
Very logical when you look at it that way, right?
So the thigh bone is connected to the knee bone, the hip bone, and so on. Literally, a position of bones and joints in one area will affect the position of bones and joints in the other areas up the stream. And what would be the next layer? What's the next sort of?
I think, again, assuming that people understand bones and joints, I think the next thing that most people are aware of are muscles and tendons, right? I think most people kind of get that connection. So when we look at, I say that we start at the foot. When we're looking at going into that flat foot posture or that pronated posture, gravity will drop your foot naturally, but we have muscles that have to control that, right? And that's essentially every muscle on the underside of the foot. So all those muscles have to work in order to control the drop. Now, if you follow that up the chain of events, so we know again that if I'm dropping my foot, if I'm pronating my foot, I'm going to internally rotate my shin, I'm going to internally rotate my thigh bone, so my femur, and that's going to go into hip internal rotation naturally. So in your brain, you start thinking what muscles are controlling all of those motions. So from a hip perspective, if I'm going into hip internal rotation, the hip external rotators are going to control it, right? So we know from an anatomical standpoint, there are these little hip external rotators around the back of your hip. Got a few of them back there, right? That are going to externally rotate the hip. So they have some influence of controlling that motion. Agree?
Agreed.
Makes sense?
Yep.
One of them in particular called the obturator internus, which is, again, if you Google it, it's the back part of the hip. Where it sits is under the inside of your bottom bone, okay? It has...
Like your sit bones.
Yeah, your sit bones. When we get to the fascial part, what comes next, it has pretty much the same attachment point and a fascial connection to the muscles of your pelvic floor. So we know that if you change the tone or the motion in that muscle, it's going to influence the pelvic floor muscles. Now, if the pelvic floor muscles get more taut or have more tension, and that has some reason to do with my hip external rotators, that's going to influence my diaphragm mechanically from probably two main reasons. One is if there's more tension in the pelvic floor, when I breathe in to drop my diaphragm to allow for things to happen, it can't necessarily go as far because there's too much tension at the bottom. So it's like I'm trying to drop from the top, but the floor is way too hard and I can't move. Whereas naturally, when the diaphragm drops, the pelvic floor will drop. Kind of like a trampoline. When you jump on it, it goes down and then it springs back up.
Yeah, so they both should move in unison.
Yes, and so therefore it's just getting blocked. And I think that's the first part of the issue. And then the second part is when you have tension through your pelvic floor, that often creates muscular tension in different parts, around different parts of your hips. And again, if we know that you're increasing tone and reducing movement, that's going to then potentially just influence muscles that are attaching around the pelvis, and then up into the same attachment point where your diaphragm is.
Okay.
Make sense?
Makes sense.
So again, that's I think that the main way that you look at it from a muscle standpoint, because again, that influences it directly. And then the other indirect ways that, we always encourage people to say get better foot dexterity or get better muscle control, get muscle strength. If you're, from a foot up perspective, your calf muscle, as an example, can't take on the load when your knee goes forward over the toe. Somewhere else has to deal with that load. That's going to go up the chain, whether that's to the joint, to the other muscles, etc. So we know from a load sharing or load distribution model, if my lower limb can't take on the load like it should, then the load comes up the chain. That's going to create more tension or tone more proximally around my hip or around my lower back. Therefore, I'm not going to be able to move my diaphragm and pelvic floor as much because they're working too hard to be static and keep the control. Whereas really what we want is that cool foot that has 33 joints should be adapting and moving, allowing me to not have so much tension up the chain. And we know that through research that shows if you sprain your ankle, you tend to have a lot more tone or muscular tension proximally, given the fact that the body is trying to minimize the amount of movement distally.
Yeah.
So again, it all just comes down to muscle tone and tension, but that's going to influence the way in which the diaphragm has the ability to move. Deep concept.
It is deep. And so the restrictions in one area, this kind of comes back to what we always talk about with the feet. We want the option of going pronation and supination. And if you have a restriction in one of those movements, let's say you struggle to pronate, then it sounds like the effect is that you will have a harder time breathing, potentially.
Yes, and and this kind of links into the fascial stuff too, but it's if you look at it from when my foot drops, it's dropping to the floor for a reason. So can my pelvic floor drop? Can my diaphragm drop with it? It all has to kind of drop and work in unison. When I go to jump, it's probably a really good example. I go to do a counter movement jump, which is where I swing my arms down to spring back up. I'm breathing in as I'm going down, right? I'm wanting my foot to bow or to go into pronation to allow relative stretch of fascial stuff, which we'll talk about in a sec. But as my foot bows, as I breathe in, my diaphragm drops. And if my diaphragm's dropping, my pelvic floor should be dropping. So they're all dropping in unison, and then they're all releasing as I go up. So it's the same on if you're doing a bench press, I'm breathing in on the way down, I'm pushing on the way up. If I'm doing a squat, I'm breathing in for the way down, and I'm breathing out on the way up. It's the same general premise, but it's all dropping, and then it's all lifting.
Yeah. So in a sense, you can kind of think about movements all as a series of rotations to a degree.
Yes.
Obviously, there's flexion and extension if you want to go into the cardinal planes and all of that. But as you squat, you're getting flexion, extension of the knee and the hip and so on. But you're also getting these rotations through these fascial slings is basically what you're talking about, because we've talked about fascia before, but it's basically connective tissue that surrounds all of our muscles and connects all of our muscles to each other and to the bones. And the elasticity of that fascia can help, basically is what gives us efficiency of movement especially through natural movements like walking, running, jumping, etc. And it's related to the storage and release of that elastic energy.
Yeah, so before we really clarify that point, to your point about rotation, pretty much everything in the body is rotation.
Yeah.
When you have to learn the anatomy and we learn about joints, it's rare. It's only really in the little wrist bones and in some of the foot bones where they are purely just sliding by themselves. Often there's a slide and a rotate.
Yeah.
There's almost always going to be some level of rotational force with the way that your body then translates that into what we'd call a linear force or a straight line force. It doesn't really just straight line itself.
Yeah.
It's like even running straight forward, whilst the act of running is probably linear, the way that we do it is all rotation.
Sure. If you throw a ball straight at someone, like you pitch a baseball, it looks like a really straight throw, but all of that is rotationally generated.
So much rotation.
Yeah, and you can't throw a ball very fast without basically full body rotation.
Try it, doesn't work.
Yeah.
Yeah, you really can't.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think that's a really key point, that a lot of it is rotation. So it requires your body to be able to rotate, whether it's left and right, up or down, supinate, pronate. It's all like this push-pull system in the body.
Sure. And I think people maybe just haven't made that connection of the breath being part of that.
Yeah, and I mean, most people innately, if you go from this podcast and go like, think about the next time you pick up a weight, or next time you pick up the groceries, or you think about doing some form of activity, you are always going to be breathing. If you don't breathe, you die. So it's like innately breathing is a part of the human existence. You need to breathe. Breathing is just movement of certain muscles and certain things. So it's already movement. It's just how does that connect? And there's a lot of habitual things that you'll see people do really, really well when like they haven't had injuries and stuff. They tend to breathe in certain ways, or they figure out certain movement patterns. Same is true for when you get hurt. Like if someone's had a back pain experience, or they've got other pain experiences, they tend to go, they tense and they claw, and they don't necessarily breathe in and breathe out fluidly. They sort of and hold that tension because it's a way of being stable.
Sure.
So like the act of learning to breathe with the movement is allowing this, what we'd call like reflexive stability, or balance. Like I'm not tensing anything. It's like you're on a balance beam. It's like at no point are you rigid and stuck. You are flowing with whatever,
You
is
go
happening,
one way, you go the other way.
but you haven't fallen off.
Sure.
And it's very fluid in nature, and it looks very peaceful.
It's unstably stable.
Yes.
People often think of stable as just rigid and still, but
Doesn't
fluid
quite
and
work.
relaxed is still stable as long as you're in balance.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think to finish that point is on the fascia, like you were talking about, which we touched on before. All of those muscles can't work in series together or in sequence together without fascia. So fascia does go around each of our deepest level of muscles, like the muscle myofibrils, etc., all the way through. It's if you ever look at a muscle graph that shows you each section, you see there's so much connective tissue.
There's fascia in between at every level.
There's literally fascia everywhere. And I think the big key premise here is that when you look at a muscle, and most people can kind of get this idea of tendon, muscle, tendon, it doesn't always necessarily work that way, but just assume that's the model. That muscle has to pull on that tendon to create a reaction. So there is fascia or connective tissue that is essentially in a line with muscle, that the muscle is really important to do the job. So if the muscle is weak, the muscle doesn't have capacity, it can't pull on the fascia to do the job. Same as said, and what we touched on before, is if you're stiff in a joint, so let's say your big toe can't come up, then there is just connective tissue that is not in line with that muscle, that is just on its own little path over here, that is essentially parallel to those ones that you can't get access to because your joint's stiff.
Sure.
So you're not then necessarily loading it and winding it up and getting the potential free energy of the elastic energy or elastic recoil because the joint's stiff. And then that in itself...
Which means you have to do more work.
Yeah, from the big toe or from the toes perspective, we've talked about it in the past of the windlass mechanism, which is in essence when you pick up your big toe, essentially any of your toes, it creates this pulling on your plantar fascia and the other fascia in your foot that winds your foot up and becomes that rigid lever to get ready to supinate or to do stuff. And if I'm lacking that, if I'm lacking the ability to do that from a foot perspective, then where else am I going to try and get the power from? I'm going to have to create tension somewhere else to be able to jump.
Yeah.
It doesn't work as well because, again, the foot is designed to do that in such a way, whereas my hip is designed a lot more to have all the muscles around it to be quite powerful in essence. So,
sure. And if for people listening, a good way to visualize this, most people have seen someone walk or run and it just looks like a lot of effort. It just looks really hard.
yes.
And you've also seen someone probably on the Olympics running along and it just looks graceful, effortless. They're performing at a ridiculously high level, but they make it look easy. And that is related to, that's efficiency basically. They're both doing the same activity and they both would get from A to B, they're both effective, but one is efficient and you can actually see it.
I think that's a really good point, is like, you completing the task, if that is the goal, is still good. Like, you've completed the task. If your goal is to complete it in a way that you deem better or faster or with less fatigue.
Easier recovery.
There are ways to do that, which we often just use as the word efficiency because it is being more efficient. It doesn't necessarily make it better, but it does make it more efficient.
Yeah.
So,
and in many ways, it could be perceived as better.
Yes, 100%. And I mean, and the last part with the fascia, it is worth noting, again, like, you can easily draw that line from your foot to your pelvic floor. If you just follow the line up the spine, like, there's a ligament in the front of your spine. It's called the AL, the anterior longitudinal ligament. Your diaphragm attachment blends into that on the front of the vertebra on the spinal column. Ironically enough, you can actually continue to make that connection all the way up to your deep neck flexors. So your deep neck flexors are the muscles at the front of your neck that pull your head down or lift it up off the ground. They attach down the same line through the same ligament. And it probably shocks people to understand that a lot of tendons don't necessarily attach to bone. They attach to the sheath of connective tissue around said bone, which is completely different when you look at it from like how attachment sites get irritated and then where the load gets shifted when I put tension through a muscle, then through a tendon, then through, whether it be that ligament or like through other fascia, where does that get transmitted to? And you see it play out in real time when, like, if anyone tries to balance on a single leg, literally put your fingertip just on a wall and feel how much more balanced you get.
It's crazy.
It is literally that getting played out by the smallest amount of force input.
Yeah. Yeah, when we were in Chicago for the Barefoot Shoe Expo Anya's event, which
looked amazing.
It was awesome. Yeah. I'm sorry to rub it in, but it was amazing. But we had a little workshop with James Earls, who wrote.
You actually got to meet him.
Yeah, I got to meet him. Yeah, I got a signed copy of his new book.
Oh, damn.
Yeah, sorry again, rubbing it in, but. So for those listening, James Earls wrote Born to Walk, which is basically all about this concept of myofascial efficiency while walking through locomotion. He also wrote a book called Understanding the Human Foot, which I'm getting through. Were you aware of that one?
Yeah, I have it. I have not read that one because I remember when you got the last, like we read the last one about the same time. And we're like, oh, this is legit.
They're pretty dense books, but amazing guy. But anyway, he gave us a really simple drill, which I'm hopefully going to try and talk people through right now. But if you, just to illustrate this point of the connection, so if you stand on one leg and try and push the other leg behind you into hip extension as though you are walking.
Yep.
And then...
Is my foot on the ground or in the air, that back leg?
And the back leg is in the air.
Okay.
So you're just pushing it back as far as you can. Use something for balance if you need to. And then just jut your head as far forward as you can. And that's the only thing you change. And then try and do the same movement with your hip. And, everyone sort of starts smiling because it's like, I can't move my hip anywhere near as much. And all I've done is move my head. Another one is rotating behind you, like trying to reach as far behind you with one arm. So if you put your hand out, thumbs up, and just focus on your thumb and try and get your thumb all the way behind you. I can't demonstrate it right now on video, but and then look what happens at your feet as you move in those directions. And then if you're rotating right, put an imaginary block on your left foot to stop it from flattening into the ground.
Yeah.
And then go again and try and get as far and see how it feels.
Doesn't work.
It either doesn't work or it works and you have to work so much harder to get there and things start tightening up in your lats and in your rhomboids and you're really trying to work through this thing. So this whole point that we're getting at is the movement doesn't always have to be so effortful, and often if it's feeling like it's too hard, it might be because you're lacking efficiency because of these, restrictions in one area, like your foot, can cause you to work way harder in your thoracic spine or in your neck,
we
or
see
vice
with
versa.
Swimmers and runners all the time, and I think to your point, like what you did there is exactly what we teach a lot of, like your head posture, your tongue posture, your jaw posture, what we talked about, which we'll do another pod on, is like your vision and stuff. All those things influence where you put stuff in space. And if my head's really far forward, you'll see a natural reaction of the body. And all of a sudden, everything lower, then it changes how it's able to move based on, again, just length, tension, relationships, and like the signaling that's coming from the nerves about what I want it to do. Like, it's not shocking when you watch these things to us, but they're really powerful tools to practice for yourself or with clients, because like that, like you do that one experience, like, so maybe I shouldn't have my head so far forward all the time.
Yeah, and it's it's quite squirrely, because there's a lot of people that are on this wagon of like, well, posture doesn't matter. The research has shown that it's not correlated with pain and so on, and there is truth in that, because there isn't a clear causational thing of like, if you have forward head posture, then you end up with neck pain. But you can easily demonstrate to yourself, literally in a matter of seconds, that changing your head position or changing your foot position or not allowing your foot to move in a certain way will cause you to work harder in other areas. And
100%.
so the question is, do you want to have to work harder in other areas while you're trying to do some kind of movement, whether you're trying to perform a sport or just trying to move about your day freely? Do you want these areas to be working harder than they have to?
Well, and that was always the point that I started off with, like respiration, of like, if your diaphragm's supposed to do most of the work with breathing, and then you're always recruiting the other muscles to help because the diaphragm can't do its job. You take away the psychological, neurological, and every other factor about it and just go purely mechanical. It's more energy demanding.
Yeah.
So like, it's no wonder that you get tired, or it's no wonder that you see certain people who are stressed, like lacking energy for certain things, because it's, again, physically, they're just using more energy to complete the same task, which, again, it's not good or bad, it's just a thing, but it is harder. And like, to your point about posture, it's really, that whole world's going to be interesting, I think, to the day we pass away, because it's like, you have really flexible people and really stiff people, and you get people across that spectrum, and they all do the same thing, and they all react differently. So no one can wholeheartedly say, this is the thing that you have to do, because your body moves different to their body. And like, these little things are just so different, but there's this universal truth to it, that if literally everyone puts their head forward, at some point it'll influence how far your shoulder comes up, or like how much X does Y. And that's why we're going to see people debate it to the nth of time.
Yeah.
Or we could just be more practical and like have a look, have like tests or like outcome measures and go, does this influence your thing? Does that make you feel or move better? Let's do that.
Yeah.
Because it's so much easier.
Yeah. I think what I like from all that posture research is taking away the labels of good and bad. Like, there probably are some contexts where you want to have a forward head posture for some time. It's just that you don't want to be stuck in that head posture and not be able to get into a more aligned, a quote unquote neutral position.
Well, I'll
when you
give
want
you an
to.
example straight away. Like, let's say you want to focus on a task, right? So to focus on a task, your eyes have to converge. So which means they have to come together to a point. Like, literally look up at the sky. Just look up as much as you can, tilt your head back, and then try and focus on something up there and tell me what happens. Like, it's really hard. Like, it's mechanically hard. We don't really practice it that much, and there's a reason that we come down into here. It creates this level of like focus and stability where we close from, again, this is probably a bit more philosophical, close the outside world off, hone on really into the task that we're doing, and we get stuff done. That's what sort of separates humans from animals.
True. You can imagine, like an early hominid making a tool, or like, something, and their head is forward like
There's
this.
no way they're sitting with
this.
their head upright looking, oh yes, oh yes.
Yeah, they're down here and they're doing this.
And that's fine.
And that's great. It's just when they run, they don't run like this.
And they probably weren't doing it like on a computer for 12 hours a day, 6 days a week.
So the key there is variability,
Yes.
which I think we have talked about a lot. It's always worth emphasizing.
Always.
And
Always.
it's options. It's variability and options, and knowing what option is right for which context, and almost sort of subconsciously knowing it just through practice, basically.
Because your body is always trying to find movement solutions to movement problems, and like The way you get on a balance beam, as an example, is different. The way I get on the balance beam, because we've got different bodies, different genetics, different injury histories, so we do things differently, different amounts of training, so it's always going to be variable. But doesn't mean like the gross movement isn't similar. It's like running. Everyone runs exactly through the same 3 phases of running. It's just how you do it, the speed in which you do things, they all vary, but it's exactly the same stuff. So can you make it more efficient, less efficient by changing slight things? 100% you can.
Exactly. Yeah, like you and I, if we go on a balance beam...
You're often better than me.
Well, yeah, of course.
Yeah. I'd like to hope so too.
But, you know, we might balance a bit differently. Like if we took a time lapse of us balancing for a minute on a beam, we're both going to, and you compared that to someone who has never been on a beam and is just sort of stiff and rigid on it, then you and I are going to be balancing differently, but we're both getting the job done and it looks, at a global level, it looks pretty similar compared to someone who's trying to stay rigid. They're just trying to stay rigid and then stepping off. Whereas we're staying on, we're doing it, and it looks much less effortful.
I'd probably say, like, as a general rule, yours looks a lot more chaotic sometimes. And it's because you can go so much further through range with control. It's like I've seen you kick legs out sideways and like, that looks wild. That's because you've trained so much to get to that place, which looks unstable to me, as an example, and looks really unstable to someone who's never tried it. But you're in like control because your body is just in that flow state, just figuring out what it needs to do, which is why it looks graceful for the most part.
Yeah, it's sort of constantly calibrating. Yeah,
which is again solving the problem.
Yeah,
which is cool.
Exactly.
I suppose the last part we have to touch on with the connections is the neurological one, which I don't think we have to spend too long on because it's not too complicated. But there is, again, it's not necessarily the easiest to make this neurological connection. Like, think of nerves and the way nerves function from your diaphragm down, but your pelvic floor is the easy place to start. Your pelvic floor is innervated by a bunch of nerves that comes out from your sacrum. So whether it's S1, S2, S3, like whatever we want to look at, just different nerves that come out from that area. Your foot has a bunch of the same like nerve roots, which is like, we use the term nerve root for where the nerve comes out of the spine, right? They have the same nerve root. So like in the foot, there's a lot of like S2, 3. In the pelvic floor, there's a lot of the same sort of stuff. Not all of them, but they're all the same. So when you trace back into the nerve roots, they're coming from the same origin in the spine. So like, as an example, don't overdo it, but let's say you literally just cut the nerve roots off at S2,
don't overdo it.
Yeah.
I'd say don't do that at all.
Well, it's just like, then you would lose function of like all of it at the same time.
Sure.
We know that through seeing what happens to people who unfortunately become paraplegic or quadriplegic,
Right.
and what happens to like global areas of the body if the nerve gets damaged. Now, what's interesting for people to understand is that one nerve root is still the amalgamation of many thousands of like little nerve endings. So like, they're not exactly the same, but if I irritate the nerve root, I can irritate every sort of nerve that's coming from that space. And within nerves, again, there's lots of fascia. Each nerve is wrapped around by some form of fascial tissue, the same the muscles are. So you have this neurological connection from that point. And then
for people listening, this is why someone could have an issue in their back and they feel it all the way down their leg.
Yeah, often sciatica is the key one, right? Like I feel
people know sciatica.
Yeah, like I have this pain in my butt, on my back, but it's also in my calf.
Yeah,
it's like it happens almost all the time with sciatica. The same is then said like in reverse from a sensory standpoint, because like, you know, that your skin has these different nerve endings, or like, again, which nerve roots they're coming from, the sensation it's picking up from the environment around you, or like the stretch receptors, etc., that it's sending feedback back to your spine, your nervous system, your central nervous system. It's essentially like the same sort of stuff, sending the signal up, and then obviously it's going to go up the spinal cord into the brain. The brain's going to make a decision about whatever it's feeling, and then there's this motor output that comes back. So the way that your foot functions can influence that signal up, and therefore what the outcome's going to be, which can influence what's happening on the pelvic floor. Take away the mechanical stuff and the fascial stuff. If I keep getting sensory feedback, I'm saying like, ooh, I don't like that. I don't like the feel of it. As an example,
or maybe if you're not getting enough sensory feedback.
Yeah, correct. Yeah, and like you just lack the sensory like receptors. Like a simple one is like the tension. So you literally step on a hot something or a pin, and you have that natural reflex to pull away.
Sure.
That comes from your neurological system. It's a reflex that you don't really control. That creates tension automatically in the myofascial system. that will create tension on your pelvic floor, therefore on the diaphragm as it tries to do its thing.
Yeah. So I always like to go to the eyes as an example. Like if you put a blindfold on and you go and navigate through a room, you're going slow, you're pretty tense, and you're sort of, your body doesn't feel very safe.
No.
And it can be quite stressful. So similarly, if you block a lot of the sensory input from your feet, they're actually really important sensors, which we talk about all the time, then it kind of makes sense that that's going to be somewhat of a stressor, really,
yes.
to the whole system, because it's not getting the sensory input that it needs from the ground to know how to organize itself efficiently in the rest of the body.
And that probably links into a lot of what we try to teach people, the podiatry students included, that like sensory feedback. It's like, it's coming from your eyes, it's coming from your vestibular system, your urinary system, or it's going to be coming from proprioception, which is essentially everything else about how your body moves and feels and stuff. And whilst proprioception is a lot less, technically speaking, than the vision, it's still like a chunk, right? A big chunk. And if it's
still significant.
If the feedback, and this is actually interesting to note across all three of those things, is the feedback is reduced or is not trustworthy, like in that proprioceptive sense, your muscles, everything in your body will want to tense.
Yeah.
Because all of that almost always comes out as tension, because it wants a place of stability and safety every time. And like when we do our podcast on vision and vestibular stuff, then we'll go on to the reverse with how the other stuff does it as well. But it's so interesting to see, like, a lot of people just have so much tension. And again, this is where, the Thomas Myers thing, I think, was like let's roll the foot out and then see what happens to your toe touch.
Sure.
Which is what got people all this aha moments, right? And like whether you believe in his work or not, take that out. People were legitimately going from can't bend past my knees to touching my toes just by rolling the foot. And again, that is just learning to take on some force and some load into the foot, changing the way that the body is perceiving where it is in space.
And you can do a similar thing with just breathing. Without
100%.
even rolling the foot out, just breathe long, slow, deep on the ground and retest your toe touch. And not invariably, but impressively frequently, people will find that it significantly improves their toe touch. And so, it sort of works both ways. Like if there's not enough sensory input coming from the sensory system in the feet, then like you said, that's going up the nerves. The brain is feeling essentially more protective, creating tension in the system, which will affect your breathing, and then vice versa. If you can consciously focus on your breathing, that can actually down-regulate this tension in the system to open up more movement, right?
Yeah, 100%. Maybe we should make a little video on that, put that on the Instagram.
Yeah,
Sounds
I think
like
that's a good idea.
I was just imagining get the whole crew out there and let's do it.
Yeah, we should actually.
Yeah. But yeah, I think that really does cover a lot of it. There are other ways that you could go into it too, like Eastern medicine style, or touch points or trigger points and other. But I think those.
Save that for another.
Yeah, I think that really covers a lot of how it's connected and hopefully that's understandable enough for people to digest. It's a lot when you're trying to look at all the aspects, but.
I'm just trying to think if we've fully answered the client's question. So Tom, I just breathed on my back. It was way easier than when I'm standing up. So with all of that, obviously you're not going to have told them all of that, but with all of that background for people listening, so why is it harder to breathe while I'm standing up on one leg?
It's a great question. So I think to really create a synopsis,
basically just a summary. Yeah.
Yeah, it's kind of firstly, it's gravity. And I always use gravity because when gravity is coming down this way when you're standing, your diaphragm and pelvic floor are working differently. We also know that because you're standing upright, your muscles are having to respond differently and coordinate through a lot more than lying on your back. Because lying on your back, everything's safe. You've got the feedback of the bed. But when you're standing, your foot, which has the 33 joints, then your knee and then your hip, and then all the muscles attaching, having to coordinate. And that creates tension onto your hip and back. And then it becomes harder for you to mechanically breathe because you're trying to find this safety, subconsciously, and you're a bit stiffer, and it's just hard to hold. So what we're looking to do is, can we create this position of relative safety and control? And that's going to come by you learning how to breathe, which is just a movement, whilst you're standing on that leg.
Perfect. That's what I wanted to hear. It's basically bringing it all together. You stand up And especially if you, if there's restrictions or, quote unquote dysfunctions, then there's tension in the system, which makes it harder to breathe. And so let's say someone does really struggle. They can do it in lying. They're really struggling in standing. Are you taking them through other positions?
Yes.
Yeah.
100%.
I was going to say, is it just a matter of learning to breathe while standing, or do you sort of go from lying through different positions?
So I think we made mention in our very first breath podcast, like Kelly Starrett said it, like if you can't breathe in a position, you don't own it, right? And I think that for most humans, we've been spending most of our time upright, hopefully. So like you don't necessarily need to go through this really systematic, like really rigid protocol to get people back. But you just have to appreciate the concept of progressive overload and the law of specificity, which are two standard training principles for everything, which we talked on in was it our rehab podcast or whatever?
Yeah.
And again, the simple concept of like if you're laying on your back, your diaphragm and pelvic floor are essentially perpendicular to the ground, but they are parallel to each other. As you go upright, the relationship changes, like essentially a full, what's that, 90 degrees?
Yep.
So like I'll often go through progressions for people, and that this is like if you're in, say, lying on your back or on your stomach is the easier one. Can we go to like a rock back position where you're on your hands and knees? Can we go to full 4-point kneel? Can we then go up into like a kneeling position, and then can we go into like a somewhat of a standing position, and then into a squat or a single leg? And like the reason for the progressions is not just because of gravity, it's also the way that the joints have to coordinate and how hard does it get.
Because if you're kneeling, it's far less complex than if you're standing, simply because you're not on your feet, right?
Yeah, more joints, because again, 33 joints
there's
each
a
side.
bigger base of support, because your feet are actually a very small base of support
relative to your thigh or your shin, heaps.
Yeah.
And again, with more joints comes more coordination required.
And we're actually the animal with the smallest base of support for the highest center of gravity.
I think I remember seeing that somewhere.
I think Tom Myers said that.
Yeah, but it also makes sense though, relatively, because you look at most animals, like a kangaroo's a tall one, but look how big their feet are.
Exactly. Yeah.
Huge.
So, obviously we should be able to stand on our feet as a natural thing, but people, simply because of the shoes, chairs, modern lifestyle, modern environment, their bodies are just, they don't realize, but their bodies are actually essentially stressed by standing up.
And again,
because they're not stable.
They are achieving the task of living and doing work.
Effectively.
Yeah, effectively.
But not efficiently.
Is it efficient, and can it be done better and save you energy and make you less stressed? The answer to that is yes.
Yeah.
It can be done.
And for whatever reason, making those changes, becoming more efficient in movement, increasing stability, balance, coordination, for whatever reason, that tends to help a lot of people get out of pain.
And you'd be surprised, like the number of things that seem to clear up when you start just doing like basic fundamental work. Like it doesn't get rid of everything, and I wish it would.
Pain is not that simple, unfortunately.
No.
In some cases, and in a lot of cases, it is that simple.
Yes.
So, let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater.
Not yet.
Not yet.
But yeah.
Well, that's a good place to wrap it up, I think.
So, yeah.
That was great. I hope everyone listening found that easy enough to understand. Sometimes it is hard to explain these kinds of topics through audio. There is a video version where Tom has been using his hands nicely to show some of what he's talking about as best he can.
Also, feel free to send questions.
Send questions.
Yeah, lots of questions.
Yep. We love getting questions. We, obviously you can reach out to us on Instagram. We do have our Explorer community where you can talk to us live on calls. Tom actually hasn't been on the calls yet, but I'm keen to get him on some.
Yeah, I've been settling into that new job, but I have more time now, so I'll be on the call soon.
And hopefully more podcasts as well. We got Friday afternoon kind of podcast arvo every few weeks. I think it'd be cool to crack out another one.
And try and see if I can beat him at pong. Have not yet beaten James at ping pong. So.
That's going to be a hard one.
Yes.
But yes, well, thank you for your dose of wisdom, my friend.
Thank you, sir.
It's always a pleasure. And look forward to the next time. Thank you everyone for listening. Catch you on the next episode.
Ciao.
Thanks for tuning in to the Restore to Explore podcast. If you enjoyed the episode, we'd really appreciate you leaving a review wherever you're listening. That's the best way to support us and to help us reach more people. If you're after more free TFC education or training,
Looking for any of our TFC tools, natural footwear discounts, or you want specialised guidance on your foot health journey from a trusted TFC health professional, head to thefootcollective.com. All of the important links are in the show notes of the episode.